There was an age when setting foot on land was the greatest risk a creature could take. While the oceans held only familiar dangers, the forests above seethed with monsters. Dragonflies with wings wider than hawks hunted from the air. Wolf-sized scorpions claimed the shadows. Centipedes as long as trees ruled the ground. The very air itself fueled this nightmare, swelling small creatures into giants that made solid earth more perilous than the deepest sea. In this upside-down world, our vertebrate ancestors learned a lesson that contradicts everything we know about survival. When death comes hunting, flee to the water, not because the water held no threats, but because the threats on land had grown so immense that even the deadliest predators of the deep seemed gentle by comparison. Picture an early amphibian as it breaks the surface of a murky Carboniferous swamp. Its heavily muscled frame and powerful limbs mark it as one of the first vertebrates brave enough to venture onto land. But today, like so many days before, the land has proven too dangerous. Above the surface, something stirs the undergrowth with sinister patience, something with too many legs, moving with the unhurried confidence of a predator that knows its prey has nowhere left to run. Here, beneath the dark water, there is sanctuary. The creature's primitive lungs allow it to remain submerged, while death all but guaranteed stalks the shoreline above. Through the water's surface, distorted by gentle ripples, shadows suggest something massive patrolling just beyond the reeds. Its heart pounds with a rhythm that echoes through 300 million years to reach us, carrying the primal memory of a time when solid ground meant terror. This scene unfolded countless times across the steaming landscapes of the Carboniferous Period, a 60 million year chapter when the rules of survival were written in reverse. For the first and only time since complex life began exploring terrestrial environments, ancient oceans and waterways became refugees from a land transformed into something alien and hostile. What created this nightmare world, where arthropods grew to impossible sizes and vertebrates could only survive by remaining forever tied to the water that had given them birth? The answer lies in the very air itself, in an atmospheric revolution so profound that it rewrote the rules of life on Earth and created the only period in history when the ocean was safer than land. 350 million years ago, during what geologists call the Carboniferous Period, our planet experienced something that has never happened before or since, a complete reversal of the natural order that governs where safety can be found. For nearly every moment in Earth's long history, large predators have ruled the seas while smaller, more cautious creatures found refuge on land. Think of any nature documentary today. Great whites patrol the oceans, while deer graze peacefully in meadows. Orcas dominate the depths, while birds nest safely in trees. But during the Carboniferous, this fundamental law of survival had been turned completely upside down. The continents had become hunting grounds for arthropods, so massive and so numerous that they transformed every forest, every clearing, every stream bank into a gauntlet of terror for early vertebrates trying to establish themselves on land. Meanwhile, the oceans remained relatively peaceful sanctuaries where normal-sized fish and marine creatures lived according to rules that any modern biologist would recognize. This wasn't a brief anomaly or a localized phenomenon. For 60 million years, longer than the entire age of dinosaurs, Earth's terrestrial ecosystems were dominated by creatures that would have seemed like manifestations from humanity's deepest nightmares. Dragonflies with wingspans reaching nearly the height of a person soared through ancient skies, their compound eyes scanning for any movement below. Scorpions the size of large dogs scuttled through undergrowth on legs designed for pursuit. Millipedes longer than fallen logs processed fallen vegetation with the casual authority of creatures that had no natural enemies. The world that supported these giants was itself alien by modern standards. Vast swamp forests stretched across equatorial regions, their canopies supported by trees that looked nothing like modern woodlands. These weren't the familiar oaks and maples we know today, but towering scale trees and giant ferns that created cathedral-like spaces beneath their crowns. The very air that drifted through these primeval forests held nearly twice today's oxygen, an intoxicating atmosphere that supercharged any creature able to exploit it. And arthropods were uniquely positioned to benefit from this oxygen-rich world. Their primitive respiratory systems, which had seemed like evolutionary limitations in earlier periods, suddenly became powerful advantages that allowed them to grow to sizes that physics should have made impossible. While early vertebrates struggled to extract enough oxygen from the air to power their complex internal organs, arthropods could simply absorb what they needed through their body surfaces and transport it efficiently to every cell. The result was a planetary ecosystem unlike anything that had existed before or would exist again. Picture landscapes where the rustle of leaves might signal the approach of something vast, moving through the shadows. Imagine skies where a sudden darkening overhead could belong to a dragonfly with jaws powerful enough to snatch creatures the size of house cats. Envision shorelines where the distinction between water and land meant the difference between safety and almost certain doom. Or the early amphibians and primitive reptiles that represented the future of vertebrate evolution, this Carboniferous world presented challenges that would shape their development for millions of years to come. They were forced to remain small, to stay close to water, and to develop survival strategies that prioritized concealment over confrontation. The very traits that we associate with successful vertebrates today, large size, territorial behavior, complex social structures, were liabilities in a world ruled by arthropod giants. This period teaches us something profound about the contingent nature of evolution and the delicate balances that determine which kinds of creatures can dominate planetary ecosystems. The Carboniferous reveals that our modern world, where vertebrates rule the land and arthropods remain mostly small and inconspicuous, is not inevitable, but rather the result of specific atmospheric conditions that have persisted for hundreds of millions of years. Understanding this reversed world requires us to journey deep into the science of atmospheric chemistry, the biology of giant arthropods, and the survival strategies of our own ancestors as they navigated the only period in Earth's history when water truly was safer than land. The secret to the Carboniferous nightmare lies in something so fundamental that we rarely think about it: the very air we breathe. Today, our atmosphere contains roughly 21% oxygen, a concentration that has remained relatively stable for millions of years and supports the familiar world of moderately sized land animals we know today. But during the Carboniferous period, Earth's atmosphere contained as much as 35% oxygen, a concentration so high that it would be toxic to most modern animals. Yet it was precisely this hyperoxic atmosphere that transformed tiny arthropods into the giants that terrorized early vertebrates. To understand why this matters, we need to explore how different types of animals actually get oxygen to their cells. Vertebrates like ourselves possess sophisticated circulatory systems. Our hearts pump oxygen-rich blood through networks of vessels that deliver this vital gas directly to every tissue in our bodies. This system is remarkably efficient, but it's also complex and energy-intensive. Our hearts must work constantly, our blood must be precisely regulated, and our lungs must actively move air to maintain the oxygen supply our cells demand. Arthropods, by contrast, use a fundamentally different approach that seems almost primitive by vertebrate standards. Instead of blood vessels carrying oxygen, they rely on a network of tiny tubes called tracheae that branch throughout their bodies like an internal air conditioning system. Air enters through small openings called spiracles along their sides, then flows directly through these tubes to reach individual cells. There's no heart-pumping oxygen-rich blood, no complex circulation to maintain, just passive diffusion of gases through an increasingly fine network of air-filled channels. Under normal atmospheric conditions, this system works adequately for small arthropods, but becomes increasingly inefficient as body size increases. The physics of gas diffusion means that oxygen can only travel so far through these narrow tubes before it becomes too diluted to support the metabolic needs of active tissue. This is why modern insects rarely grow larger than your hand. Their respiratory system simply can't deliver enough oxygen to power a bigger body. But increase the oxygen concentration in the atmosphere, and suddenly these physical limitations begin to dissolve. With 35% oxygen instead of 21%, the driving force for diffusion becomes dramatically stronger. Oxygen molecules are packed more densely in the air, creating steeper concentration gradients that push the gas deeper into arthropod bodies. Tissues that would normally be starved of oxygen in a large arthropod suddenly receive adequate supplies to support active metabolism. The effect is like replacing a gentle breeze with a powerful wind. The same passive system that could only support small arthropods in normal air becomes capable of powering creatures of startling size when the air itself becomes enriched with the gas they need most. Dragonflies with wingspans reaching the length of a person's arm weren't just possible in this hyperoxic atmosphere, they were inevitable because the oxygen-rich air could finally support the metabolic demands of their massive flight muscles. For vertebrates, however, this oxygen bonanza came with serious complications. Our more sophisticated respiratory and circulatory systems, so efficient under normal conditions, can actually become liabilities when oxygen concentrations rise too high. Excessive oxygen creates reactive molecules that damage cells and tissues, what we now call oxidative stress. Modern humans breathing 35% oxygen for extended periods would suffer lung damage, nervous system problems, and cellular destruction. The early amphibians and reptiles of the Carboniferous had to navigate this oxygen-rich world with respiratory systems that were evolutionary compromises. They needed enough oxygen to power their complex vertebrate physiology, but not so much that it would poison their cells. Many likely spent much of their time in water, where dissolved oxygen concentrations remained closer to tolerable levels, or in burrows where they could avoid the most oxygen-rich surface air. This atmospheric difference also explains why arthropods remained relatively small in aquatic environments even during the Carboniferous. Water can only hold limited amounts of dissolved oxygen, regardless of atmospheric concentration. Marine and freshwater arthropods of this period were constrained by the same physical limitations that affect aquatic arthropods today, while their terrestrial relatives could take full advantage of the oxygen-saturated air above the surface. The hyperoxic atmosphere also made fire a constant presence in Carboniferous landscapes. With so much oxygen available, plant material ignited easily and burned intensely, creating regular wildfires that shaped forest composition and created the mosaic of habitats where different arthropods could specialize. These frequent fires may have actually helped maintain the oxygen-rich atmosphere by preventing the complete burial of organic matter that would otherwise consume atmospheric oxygen during decomposition. Understanding the Carboniferous atmosphere helps explain not just why arthropods could grow so large, but why they dominated terrestrial ecosystems so completely. In a world where the air itself favored their simple but effective respiratory system, arthropods possessed fundamental advantages that no amount of vertebrate sophistication could overcome. They were literally breathing easy while early vertebrates struggled with atmospheric conditions that pushed their physiology to its limits. The forests that supported these giant arthropods were themselves unlike anything that has existed before or since on Earth. Picture walking through a cathedral built not of stone, but of living wood that stretched toward the sky in forms so alien they might have been designed by architects from another world. These Carboniferous forests were dominated by trees that bore no resemblance to the familiar oaks, pines, or maples we know today. Instead, they were populated by towering scale trees called lepidodendron and massive club mosses known as sigillaria. Lepidodendron trees rose like natural skyscrapers, some reaching heights of over 100 feet on trunks that remained branchless until they exploded into crowns of primitive foliage near the top. Their bark was covered in a distinctive diamond pattern of leaf scars, creating surfaces that looked more like the scales of some enormous reptile than the bark of any modern tree. These giants weren't true trees in the modern sense. They were actually enormous relatives of today's small club mosses, scaled up to impossible proportions by the same oxygen-rich atmosphere that empowered the arthropod giants. Between these towering scale trees grew their equally impressive cousins, the sigillaria or seal trees, named for the seal-like patterns their leaf scars created on their trunks. These trees took a different architectural approach, developing thick, straight trunks that rose like enormous columns before branching into relatively modest crowns. Their surfaces were marked with vertical ridges and the distinctive scars left by fallen leaves, creating a texture that would feel almost reptilian to the touch. Giant horsetails called calamites added yet another layer to these alien forests. Where modern horsetails are modest plants that rarely exceed a few feet in height, their Carboniferous ancestors grew into towering bamboo-like structures that could reach heights of 60 feet or more. They grew in dense groves that created natural hallways through the forest, their segmented trunks and whorled branches creating geometric patterns that filtered the oxygen-rich air into constantly shifting patterns of light and shadow. These forests were marvels of natural engineering, but they were also ecosystems perfectly designed to support giant arthropods. The tall, branchless trunks of the scale trees created vast open spaces beneath the canopy, cathedral-like clearings where massive millipedes could move without obstruction and where giant dragonflies had clear flight paths between the towering columns. The lack of dense understory vegetation that characterizes modern forests meant that predatory arthropods had excellent sightlines for hunting, while the vertical structure of the trees provided countless perches and hiding places for creatures comfortable with climbing. The very chemistry of these forests contributed to the oxygen-rich atmosphere that made arthropod gigantism possible. Unlike modern trees, which are largely composed of wood and cellulose, many carboniferous plants contained high concentrations of lignin, a complex organic polymer that was difficult for the primitive decomposer organisms of the time to break down efficiently. When these trees died and fell, much of their organic matter ended up being buried in the swampy conditions that characterized many carboniferous landscapes before it could fully decompose. This burial process removed vast amounts of carbon from the atmosphere while simultaneously preventing the consumption of atmospheric oxygen that would normally occur during decomposition. The result was a gradual but steady increase in atmospheric oxygen levels as more and more plant material was buried in what would eventually become the coal deposits that give the Carboniferous Period its name. These forests were literally manufacturing the atmosphere that made their arthropod inhabitants possible. The forest floor itself was unlike anything in the modern world. Instead of the rich soil and dense understory we associate with contemporary woodlands, Carboniferous forest floors were often waterlogged and covered with a thick carpet of fallen plant material that decomposed slowly in the oxygen-poor conditions near the ground. This created a soft, spongy surface that was perfect for burrowing arthropods and provided countless hiding places for smaller creatures trying to avoid the attention of giant predators. Seasonal flooding was common in these swampy forests, creating a constantly changing mosaic of aquatic and terrestrial habitats. During flood periods, much of the forest floor would be underwater, providing temporary refuge for amphibians and forcing the terrestrial arthropods to climb higher into the trees or seek elevated ground. When the waters receded, they left behind rich deposits of organic matter that nourished new plant growth and created the anaerobic conditions necessary for the coal formation that would preserve evidence of these remarkable ecosystems for hundreds of millions of years. The canopy of these forests was a world unto itself, a three-dimensional landscape of branches, trunks, and aerial highways that giant arthropods exploited with remarkable efficiency. Massive dragonflies patrolled the open spaces between trees, while equally large spiders constructed webs that spanned the gaps between trunks. The geometric patterns created by the whorled branches of the giant horsetails provided natural perches and hunting blinds for predatory arthropods, while the smooth trunks of the scale trees offered highways for climbing creatures moving between the forest floor and the canopy. These alien forests created the perfect stage for the drama of giant arthropod dominance, a world where every level of the ecosystem, from the waterlogged forest floor to the oxygen-rich canopy, provided opportunities for creatures of impossible size to thrive and hunt. In the oxygen-rich skies above these alien forests, death wore wings. The most terrifying predators of the Carboniferous world weren't bound to the forest floor or limited to the slow pursuit of ground-based hunting. Instead, They ruled the three-dimensional realm of the Canopy, patrolling the spaces between towering scale trees with authority that no flying predator before or since has ever possessed. Meganeura, the giant dragonfly whose name means large-nerved, was the undisputed master of Carboniferous skies. With wingspans that could stretch nearly the length of a person's outstretched arms, these aerial predators dwarfed any modern dragonfly by an almost unimaginable margin. Their wings were masterpieces of natural engineering, transparent membranes crisscrossed with an intricate network of veins that provided both strength and flexibility. Unlike the simple up and down motion of bird wings, Meganeura could twist and angle each wing independently, giving them maneuverability that would make modern fighter pilots envious. But it was their hunting behavior that made Meganeura truly terrifying. These weren't gentle giants content to catch small insects and hover peacefully over ancient ponds. They were apex predators with the visual acuity of modern hawks and the predatory instincts of creatures that had evolved in a world where anything that moved might be prey. Their compound eyes, each containing thousands of individual lenses, could detect the slightest movement anywhere within their field of vision. A small amphibian venturing too far from water, an early reptile attempting to cross an open clearing, even other flying insects, all were potential meals for these aerial monsters. The physics of their flight was made possible only by the oxygen-rich atmosphere of their time. Modern dragonflies are already among the most metabolically demanding flying animals on Earth, requiring enormous amounts of energy to power their rapid wing beats and maintain their aerial agility. Scale that up to Meganeura's massive proportions, and the energy requirements become staggering. Only in an atmosphere with 35% oxygen could their flight muscles generate enough power to keep such large bodies airborne, while maintaining the speed and agility necessary for effective predation. Their hunting technique was a masterpiece of aerial strategy. Unlike modern dragonflies, which primarily hunt small flying insects, Meganeura seems to have been capable of taking much larger prey. Fossil evidence suggests they could tackle early amphibians, primitive reptiles, and even other large arthropods. They would patrol their territories with methodical efficiency, using their superior vantage point to spot prey moving through the forest below. When a target was identified, they could dive with devastating speed. Their powerful legs extended to grasp their victim, while their massive mandibles delivered a crushing bite. Even more impressive was their territorial behavior. These weren't solitary hunters, content to avoid competition with their own kind. Evidence suggests that Meganeura may have engaged in complex aerial displays and territorial disputes that could be seen and heard across vast distances. The sound of their wing beats alone would have been audible from far away, a deep, thrumming vibration that warned other creatures of approaching danger. For early vertebrates, that sound would have meant immediate retreat to the nearest water or dense cover. The closely related Meganeuropsis was even larger than its famous cousin, with some specimens showing wingspans that approached the theoretical limits of what insect flight could achieve even in oxygen-rich conditions. These giants of the ancient skies pushed the boundaries of arthropod aviation to their absolute extremes, creating flying predators whose size wouldn't be matched again until the evolution of large pterosaurs many millions of years later. But perhaps most terrifying of all was their relationship with water sources. Just as modern dragonflies require aquatic environments for reproduction, Meganeura and its relatives were tied to the ponds, streams, and swamps that dotted the Carboniferous landscape. This meant that any vertebrate seeking the safety of water had to run a gauntlet of aerial predators that treated shorelines as hunting grounds. The very refuges that early amphibians depended on for survival were patrolled by flying death. The dominance of these aerial giants created a form of ecological terror that has no modern equivalent. Early vertebrates had to develop entirely new behaviors just to avoid being spotted from above. They became primarily nocturnal, as the giant dragonflies were largely diurnal hunters. They learned to freeze motionless at the first sound of approaching wing beats. Most importantly, they developed an almost pathological attachment to dense cover and underground refuges. behavioral patterns that would influence vertebrate evolution for millions of years to come. The reign of Meganeura and its relatives lasted for tens of millions of years, creating a world where the very sky was a source of constant threat. Only when atmospheric oxygen levels began to decline toward the end of the Carboniferous period did these aerial titans finally lose their grip on the skies, leaving behind only fossils to remind us of a time when dragonflies ruled the world from above. While Meganeura ruled the skies, the forest floor belonged to predators whose very existence seemed to mock the laws of nature. Here, in the shadowy understory beneath the towering scale trees, arthropods had evolved into forms so massive and so perfectly adapted for killing that they transformed every fallen log, every patch of undergrowth, every seemingly safe hiding place into a potential death trap for early vertebrates. Pulmonoscorpius, the giant scorpion of the Carboniferous forests, stretched to lengths that would have dwarfed any modern scorpion by an almost absurd margin. Picture a predator nearly the size of a large dog, but built with the patient lethality that only millions of years of arthropod evolution could perfect. Its pedipalps, the grasping claws that modern scorpions use to seize prey, were massive structures capable of crushing bones and holding struggling victims with inexorable strength. These weren't the delicate pinchers of a modern scorpion, but powerful hydraulic mechanisms that could exert crushing forces sufficient to subdue prey, many times larger than anything a contemporary scorpion could hope to tackle. But it was the metasoma, the segmented tail that curved over the scorpion's back like a question mark of death, that made Pulmonoscorpius truly terrifying. At its tip, the telson or stinger contained venom glands that could deliver doses of neurotoxic poison sufficient to paralyze creatures the size of early amphibians within minutes. The venom itself was likely a sophisticated cocktail of compounds designed not just to kill, but to preserve the prey's meat while the scorpion fed at its leisure. Modern scorpion venoms are already among the most complex toxins in the natural world. Scaled up to Pulmonoscorpius proportions, they would have been biochemical weapons of almost unimaginable potency. These giant scorpions were ambush predators par excellence. They would position themselves in strategic locations, beneath fallen logs, in the shadows of tree roots, or partially buried in the soft organic matter of the forest floor, and wait with the infinite patience that only an arthropod can maintain. Their sensory systems were exquisitely tuned to detect the slightest vibrations transmitted through the ground or the air. When an early amphibian or primitive reptile approached within striking distance, the scorpion would explode into motion with startling speed, its massive claws reaching out to seize the victim, while its stinger curved forward to deliver its fatal dose. Even more terrifying were the giant centipedes of the Carboniferous, creatures like Vertebrate that had taken the basic centipede body plan and scaled it up to nightmarish proportions. These segmented predators could reach lengths comparable to modern crocodiles, their bodies composed of dozens of segments, each bearing a pair of powerful legs that ended in sharp claws designed for gripping prey and terrain alike. Unlike the patient ambush tactics of the giant scorpions, these centipedes were active hunters that could pursue prey with relentless determination. The hunting technique of a giant centipede was a masterpiece of coordinated motion. When pursuing prey, all of those legs would work in perfect synchronization, creating a rippling wave of movement that could propel the creature forward with surprising speed across uneven terrain. Their flexibility was equally remarkable. A giant centipede could twist and turn with fluid grace, following prey through dense vegetation or around obstacles that would stop other predators. But perhaps most frightening of all were their modified front legs, known as forcipules, which had evolved into hollow fangs connected to powerful venom glands. These weren't merely large versions of modern centipede fangs. They were sophisticated injection systems capable of delivering massive doses of fast-acting neurotoxins. A bite from a giant Carboniferous centipede would have caused almost instantaneous paralysis, followed by a slow death as the creature's digestive enzymes began breaking down the victim's tissues from within. The nocturnal habits of these ground-dwelling giants added another layer of terror to the Carboniferous world. While the giant dragonflies ruled the daylight hours, nightfall brought a different kind of predatory threat. Giant scorpions and centipedes were most active in the darkness, using their highly developed sensory systems to hunt prey that could barely see them coming. For early vertebrates, the coming of night meant retreating to whatever refuges they could find and remaining motionless until dawn. Any movement might attract the attention of predators, perfectly adapted to hunt in complete darkness. These ground hunters also controlled access to the most crucial resources in the Carboniferous world. Water sources, which were essential refuges for early vertebrates, were often patrolled by giant scorpions that had learned to position themselves along game trails and near shorelines. Food sources like concentrations of fallen fruit or areas rich in small prey were similarly guarded by predators that could afford to wait for days or weeks in a single location. The very presence of these massive ground predators shaped the behavior and evolution of every other creature in the Carboniferous ecosystem. Early vertebrates developed enhanced senses of hearing and vibration detection specifically to avoid these arthropod hunters. They evolved more efficient burrowing behaviors, faster reflexes, and an almost pathological tendency to freeze motionless at the first sign of danger. The psychological pressure of living under constant threat from such perfectly adapted predators left behavioral scars that would influence vertebrate evolution for millions of years to come. Not every giant of the Carboniferous forests was a predator, but that didn't make them any less terrifying to the small vertebrates trying to carve out a place in this oxygen-drunk world. Moving through the undergrowth with the slow, inevitable presence of a living freight train was Arthropleura, a millipede that had grown to proportions that defied every rule about how large a many-legged creature should be allowed to become. Picture a segmented creature stretching longer than most modern automobiles, its body composed of dozens of armored sections, each bearing 2 pairs of powerful legs that moved in perfect rippling coordination. Arthropleura could reach lengths of over 8 feet and stood nearly 2 feet high, dimensions that transformed what should have been a harmless plant eater into something that resembled a biological tank rolling through the ancient forests with unstoppable momentum. Despite being herbivorous, Arthropleura was far from harmless to the early vertebrates sharing its world. Its sheer size meant that anything in its path had 2 choices: move or be crushed. Unlike modern millipedes, which can be gently picked up and handled, Arthropleura was a creature whose very presence commanded respect and distance. Each of its hundreds of legs ended in sharp points that could gain purchase on almost any surface, allowing it to climb over fallen logs, traverse rough terrain, and even scale the lower trunks of trees with surprising agility for such a massive creature. The feeding behavior of these giants created its own form of environmental terror. When Arthropleura encountered a promising patch of vegetation, it would methodically process every edible plant within reach, its powerful mandibles working with mechanical efficiency to reduce ferns, fallen leaves, and rotting wood to digestible pulp. For smaller creatures that depended on the same plant resources, the arrival of an Arthropleura meant the temporary but complete destruction of their food supply. But perhaps most unnerving of all were the defensive capabilities these gentle giants possessed. When threatened, Arthropleura could roll itself into an enormous ball, creating an armored sphere bristling with sharp leg tips and protected by its tough exoskeleton. A creature that chose to attack a defensive Arthropleura would find itself facing what amounted to a biological fortress, one that could remain sealed for hours if necessary, waiting for threats to lose interest and move on. Modern millipedes also possess chemical defenses, secreting toxic or noxious compounds when disturbed. Scale this up to Arthropleura proportions, and these chemical weapons become truly formidable. The giant millipedes of the Carboniferous likely possessed glands capable of spraying significant quantities of irritating or toxic secretions, enough to create clouds of noxious chemicals that could clear an area of potential threats or make feeding areas temporarily uninhabitable for competitors. The psychological impact of sharing a forest with creatures like Arthropleura cannot be overstated. For early amphibians and reptiles, the sound of hundreds of legs moving through leaf litter would have been an unmistakable warning of approaching enormity. The vibrations transmitted through the ground by a walking arthropleura could probably be felt from considerable distances, giving smaller creatures advance warning, but also creating a constant state of nervous awareness. These herbivorous giants also competed directly with early vertebrates for some of the same resources. While arthropleura primarily fed on plant matter, early amphibians and reptiles also relied heavily on plant foods, fallen fruits, and the rich organic matter that accumulated on the forest floor. When an 8-foot millipede decided to feed in a particular area, smaller creatures simply had to find somewhere else to forage. There was no negotiating with something that massive. The trails and pathways created by arthropleura as it moved through the forest became features of the landscape in their own right. These creatures were too large to navigate around most obstacles, so they simply pushed through vegetation, creating clearings and pathways that other animals would use for generations. In some ways, arthropleura functioned as living bulldozers, constantly reshaping the physical structure of their forest habitats. The social behavior of these giants remains largely mysterious, but the discovery of multiple arthropleura trackways traveling in the same direction suggests that they may have engaged in seasonal migrations or gathered in groups during certain times of the year. The thought of encountering not just one 8-foot millipede, but an entire herd of them moving through the forest like a slow-motion stampede adds another layer of surreal terror to the Carboniferous experience. Even in death, arthropleura commanded respect. The decay of such massive creatures would have created significant changes in local soil chemistry and nutrient availability. Areas where arthropleura died and decomposed would have become temporary hotspots of fertility, attracting different plant communities and, in turn, different animals. In life and death, these gentle giants shaped their ecosystems in ways that no herbivore before or since has been able to match. For early vertebrates, learning to coexist with creatures like arthropleura meant developing entirely new concepts of personal space, resource sharing, and environmental awareness. The very presence of such massive herbivores reinforced the lesson that in the Carboniferous world, size mattered more than anything else, and vertebrates were emphatically not the largest creatures around. Among the most alien architects of the Carboniferous world were the giant spiders and their relatives, creatures that had taken the already unsettling art of web construction and scaled it up to proportions that transformed entire sections of forest into 3-dimensional death traps. While not as massive as arthropleura, or as obviously predatory as the giant scorpions, these arachnids created some of the most psychologically disturbing hazards that early vertebrates had to navigate. Atercopus and other primitive spiders of the Carboniferous had grown to sizes that would make even the most arachnophobic modern person flee in terror. With leg spans that could easily encompass a dinner plate and bodies built with the patient, methodical precision that only spiders possess, these creatures were living embodiments of calculated predation, but it was their webs that truly transformed the Carboniferous forest into something from a nightmare. Unlike modern spider webs, which are typically sized to catch flying insects, the webs of Carboniferous giants were architectural marvels designed to span the gaps between towering scale trees. Picture walking through a forest where massive sheets of silk stretched between trunks like translucent walls, each strand thick enough to be visible in dim light and strong enough to stop a running creature in its tracks. These weren't delicate morning dew masterpieces. They were industrial-strength snares, built to catch prey much larger than anything a modern spider would dare attempt. The engineering challenges of building such massive webs required entirely new approaches to silk production and web architecture. The silk glands of these giant spiders had to produce not just larger quantities of protein fiber, but different types of silk with varying properties. Some strands for structural support that could bear enormous loads, others for the actual capture spirals that would entangle struggling prey. The anchor points where these webs attached to trees had to withstand forces that would snap modern spider silk instantly. For early vertebrates, these massive webs created navigation hazards, unlike anything in the modern world. A small amphibian or reptile moving through the forest could easily blunder into one of these nearly invisible barriers, becoming instantly entangled in sticky silk strong enough to hold them, while the web's owner approached for the kill. Even creatures large enough to break through the webs would find themselves covered in clinging strands that marked them as easy targets for other predators. The hunting behavior of these giant web builders was a masterpiece of patient predation. Unlike active hunters that pursued their prey, the giant spiders could afford to wait in the centers of their webs for days or weeks, sustained by their slow arthropod metabolism. When vibrations through the web announced the arrival of trapped prey, they would move with deliberate precision across strands that could support their considerable weight, approaching their victims with the unhurried confidence of creatures that knew escape was impossible. But perhaps most terrifying of all was the psychological impact of discovering evidence of these massive webs. Early vertebrates moving through the forest would occasionally encounter the desiccated remains of large prey items wrapped in silk cocoons, clear warnings that some areas of the forest were controlled by predators, capable of taking creatures their own size or larger. The sight of something recognizable wrapped in silk and hanging from a tree would have sent an unmistakable message about the dangers of traveling through certain areas. The spatial organization of these giant webs also meant that they effectively partitioned forest habitats into safe and dangerous zones. Areas with high concentrations of giant spider webs became no-go zones for vertebrates, while clear areas became valuable corridors that multiple species would use for travel. This created a complex landscape of invisible boundaries that shaped animal behavior across entire forest ecosystems. Some of the largest arachnids may not have been web builders at all, but rather ambush predators that used their size and stealth to hunt from concealed positions. These hunting spiders could remain motionless for hours in perfect camouflage, waiting for unwary prey to pass within striking distance. For early vertebrates, this meant that even areas free of visible webs weren't necessarily safe. Any shadow, any dark crevice, any cluster of vegetation could potentially conceal a predator capable of subduing creatures many times larger than modern spiders could handle. The legacy of these arachnid giants extended far beyond their immediate predatory impact. They helped establish behavioral patterns in early vertebrates that persist to this day: the instinctive wariness of confined spaces, the tendency to test uncertain terrain before committing to movement, and the deep-seated unease that many vertebrates still feel when encountering spider webs, even harmless modern ones. For the early amphibians and primitive reptiles that represented the future of vertebrate evolution, simply surviving a single day in the Carboniferous world required a level of constant vigilance that would be exhausting by modern standards. Every moment above water was a calculated risk, every movement through the forest a potential encounter with death, in forms that ranged from the swift and aerial to the patient and hidden. Dawn in a Carboniferous forest would begin with the cautious emergence of vertebrates from their overnight refuges, burrows dug deep into soft organic matter, hollow logs that provided concealment, or shallow water where they could remain partially submerged. The first priority was always listening. The forest was never truly silent, but the quality of sounds could mean the difference between life and death. The deep thrumming of giant dragonfly wings carried across vast distances, warning of aerial predators on the hunt. The rustling of hundreds of centipede legs through leaf litter announced ground-based threats moving through the undergrowth. Feeding presented its own unique challenges in this reversed world. While modern vertebrates can often forage openly during daylight hours, Carboniferous vertebrates had to time their feeding activities around the hunting patterns of their arthropod overlords. The richest food sources, areas where fallen fruits accumulated, streams where aquatic invertebrates were abundant, or clearings where tender young plants grew, were precisely the locations most likely to be patrolled by giant predators. The psychological toll of living under such constant threat shaped behavior in ways that would influence vertebrate evolution for millions of years. Early amphibians and reptiles developed enhanced hearing specifically tuned to detect the approach of arthropod predators. They evolved improved night vision for navigating in darkness when many of the giant arthropods were less active. Most importantly, they developed an almost pathological tendency to freeze motionless at the first sign of danger, a behavior that persists in many modern vertebrates as an instinctive response to perceived threats. Navigation through the forest required skills that no modern land vertebrate needs to master. Avoiding the massive webs of giant spiders meant learning to recognize the subtle visual cues that indicated the presence of silk strands, the way light reflected differently off web-covered areas, the slight movement of vegetation that suggested attached anchor points. Reading the landscape for signs of giant scorpion ambush sites required understanding how these patient predators chose their hiding places and learning to identify the telltale signs of recently disturbed soil or vegetation. Water sources, which should have been refuges of safety, became strategic challenges requiring careful approach. The shorelines of ponds and streams were favorite hunting grounds for both aerial and terrestrial predators. A vertebrate needing to drink or cool itself in water had to first conduct reconnaissance from a safe distance, watching for the shadows of giant dragonflies patrolling overhead, or the subtle movements that might indicate a giant scorpion positioned in ambush near the water's edge. The sound landscape of the Carboniferous world was unlike anything that exists today. The wing beats of giant dragonflies created a bass note that could be felt as much as heard. The movement of massive millipedes through vegetation produced a continuous rustling that could mask the approach of other predators. Most unnerving of all were the periods of sudden silence that occurred when a major predator moved through an area, moments when all the smaller sounds of the forest would cease as every creature tried to avoid detection. Social behavior among early vertebrates was shaped by the shared experience of living under constant threat. Small groups could maintain better watch for approaching dangers, with individuals taking turns as sentries, while others fed or rested. But group size had to be carefully balanced. Too many individuals together would create more noise and movement that might attract unwanted attention from the giant predators that ruled the forest. Even sleep was a strategic challenge requiring careful planning and positioning. Safe sleeping sites were at a premium, and early vertebrates had to develop rapid awakening responses that could get them moving at the first sign of danger. The deep, restful sleep that modern animals can enjoy was simply not possible in a world where death could approach silently on hundreds of legs or descend from above on wings spanning the reach of outstretched arms. While the land had been transformed into a realm of arthropod giants, the oceans and freshwater environments of the Carboniferous world remained remarkably similar to what any modern marine biologist would recognize. Here, in the gentle embrace of water, the normal rules of predator and prey still applied, creating sanctuaries where early vertebrates could find refuge from the oxygen-drunk monsters that ruled the terrestrial world above. The key to understanding this aquatic sanctuary lies in the fundamental physics of how oxygen behaves in water versus air. While the Carboniferous atmosphere contained up to 35% oxygen, water can only hold limited amounts of dissolved gases, regardless of atmospheric concentration. The solubility of oxygen in water is constrained by basic chemistry. Even oxygen-saturated water contains far less available oxygen than the hyperoxic air that powered terrestrial arthropod gigantism. This difference in oxygen availability meant that aquatic arthropods remained bound by the same size limitations that constrain them today. Marine and freshwater scorpions, centipedes, and other arthropods of the Carboniferous period were impressive by modern standards, but nothing approaching the scale of their terrestrial relatives. A giant water scorpion might reach the size of a large lobster, formidable to be sure, but not the nightmarish proportions of Pulmonoscorpius stalking the forest floor above. Water density also worked against arthropod gigantism in ways that the thin air above could not. Moving through water requires far more energy than moving through air, and the passive respiratory systems that served terrestrial arthropods so well became significant liabilities in aquatic environments. Large aquatic arthropods would have found themselves struggling to extract sufficient oxygen from water while simultaneously working against the resistance that water movement entailed. Meanwhile, the oceans teemed with vertebrate life that had discovered effective solutions to aquatic living millions of years earlier. Early sharks had already refined their cartilaginous skeletons and efficient swimming techniques to near perfection. Bony fish had developed sophisticated gill systems that could extract oxygen from water with remarkable efficiency. These vertebrates possessed circulatory systems that gave them decisive advantages over arthropods in low-oxygen aquatic environments. The marine food webs of the Carboniferous followed patterns that would be familiar to any modern oceanographer. Small fish fed on marine invertebrates. Larger fish hunted the smaller ones, and apex predators like early sharks maintained population balance through selective predation. This was a world where size and predatory success correlated in predictable ways, where vertebrate innovations in swimming, sensing, and hunting gave them clear advantages over their arthropod competitors. Freshwater environments provided even more reliable refuges for early vertebrates. Rivers, lakes, and swamps offered not just escape from terrestrial arthropod predators, but also abundant food sources that vertebrates were well equipped to exploit. Early amphibians could feed on aquatic invertebrates, fish eggs, and other protein-rich foods that were largely inaccessible to the giant arthropods ruling the land above. The temperature stability of aquatic environments also provided crucial advantages during a period when atmospheric conditions were fluctuating rapidly. Water's high heat capacity meant that lakes and rivers maintained more stable temperatures than the air above, creating predictable thermal refugia where early vertebrates could regulate their body temperatures more effectively than on land. Perhaps most importantly, water provided three-dimensional escape routes that simply didn't exist on land. A vertebrate threatened by an aquatic predator could dive deeper, swim to different areas, or use underwater obstacles for concealment. The forest floor offered no equivalent options. Once spotted by a giant dragonfly or cornered by a massive centipede, terrestrial escape routes were severely limited. The seasonal flooding that characterized many Carboniferous landscapes actually expanded these aquatic refugia on a regular basis. When rising waters inundated terrestrial habitats, early vertebrates could expand their range into areas that were normally dominated by giant arthropods, feeding and reproducing in temporarily safe zones before retreating to permanent water bodies as flood levels receded. This fundamental difference between terrestrial and aquatic environments during the Carboniferous helps explain why early vertebrates maintained such strong ties to water, even as they developed increasingly sophisticated adaptations for terrestrial life. The ocean's embrace wasn't just a refuge, it was the foundation that allowed vertebrate evolution to continue during a period when the land above had become temporarily uninhabitable for creatures of their size and metabolic requirements. The early amphibians and primitive reptiles that managed to survive in the Carboniferous world were not passive victims of arthropod dominance. They were evolutionary innovators forced to develop survival strategies that would fundamentally shape vertebrate biology for millions of years to come. These creatures, living perpetually on the edge between safety and death, became master tacticians in the art of avoiding detection and exploitation by their giant arthropod overlords. Eriops, one of the most successful early amphibians of this period, exemplified the dual environment survival strategy that would become essential for Carboniferous vertebrates. With its robust, heavily muscled body and powerful limbs, Eriops was equally comfortable in water and on land, but more importantly, it could transition between these environments with remarkable speed when danger threatened. Its physiology was perfectly adapted for rapid retreat, combining efficient lungs for air breathing with residual gill-like structures that could extract oxygen from water during extended submersion. The timing of terrestrial activity became crucial for vertebrate survival during this period. Most early amphibians and reptiles evolved strongly nocturnal behaviors, emerging from their aquatic refuges only during the hours when giant dragonflies were inactive and many terrestrial arthropods were less alert. This shift toward nighttime activity required enhanced sensory adaptations, improved night vision, more sensitive hearing, and sophisticated vibration detection systems that could warn of approaching threats in darkness. Enhanced sensory systems were perhaps the most important evolutionary development among Carboniferous vertebrates. Early amphibians developed enlarged ear structures and improved sound processing capabilities, specifically tuned to detect the approach of giant arthropods. They evolved lateral line systems that could sense water movements from considerable distances, warning of aquatic threats while simultaneously monitoring escape routes. Most crucially, they developed enhanced sensitivity to ground vibrations, allowing them to detect the approach of massive centipedes or millipedes through the forest floor. Group behavior emerged as another crucial survival strategy during this period. While individual vertebrates were vulnerable to giant arthropod predators, small coordinated groups could maintain collective vigilance that dramatically improved survival rates. These early social structures weren't complex by modern standards, but they represented the beginning of cooperative behaviors that would eventually lead to sophisticated vertebrate societies. Groups could post sentries while others fed, coordinate movement through dangerous terrain, and share information about predator locations and safe routes. Camouflage and concealment techniques reached new levels of sophistication among Carboniferous vertebrates. Many species developed skin patterns and coloration that allowed them to blend seamlessly with the organic debris of forest floors or the dappled light patterns of shallow water. Some evolved the ability to remain motionless for extended periods, essentially playing dead when giant predators passed nearby. Others developed rapid color-changing abilities that allowed them to match their surroundings as they moved through different environments. Burrowing behavior became almost universal among terrestrial vertebrates during this period. Early amphibians and reptiles invested significant energy in digging elaborate underground refuges that provided protection from both aerial and ground-based arthropod predators. These burrows often included multiple entrances and exits, underwater access points, and chambers at different depths that could serve different functions, some for sleeping, others for food storage, and some specifically designed as panic rooms for emergency concealment. Perhaps most importantly, Carboniferous vertebrates developed highly efficient metabolisms that allowed them to survive on minimal food resources. When giant arthropods controlled access to the richest feeding areas, vertebrates had to make do with marginal food sources and intermittent feeding opportunities. This pressure led to metabolic innovations that would prove crucial in later evolutionary developments: more efficient digestive systems, improved nutrient storage capabilities, and the ability to enter states of reduced activity during periods of food scarcity. The psychological adaptations were equally important. Carboniferous vertebrates developed hair-trigger flight responses that could get them moving towards safety at the first sign of danger. They evolved an almost pathological wariness of open spaces and exposed positions. Most significantly, they developed the behavioral flexibility that allowed them to rapidly switch between different survival strategies depending on the type and proximity of threats. These survival innovations, born from the desperate necessity of living under arthropod dominance, established behavioral and physiological patterns that would persist long after the oxygen levels dropped and the giant arthropods disappeared. The evolutionary pressure of the Carboniferous world left permanent marks on vertebrate biology, creating capabilities and instincts that would serve vertebrates well in all future challenges. The development of sophisticated burrowing behaviors among Carboniferous vertebrates represented one of the most crucial adaptations for surviving in a world dominated by surface-dwelling giants. What began as simple hiding behavior evolved into complex underground engineering that created entire parallel ecosystems beneath the feet of the arthropod overlords above. Early amphibians and primitive reptiles discovered that the soft, waterlogged soils of Carboniferous swamp forests were perfect for excavation. The thick layers of decomposing organic matter created substrates that could be easily dug, but were stable enough to maintain tunnel integrity. These conditions allowed vertebrates to construct elaborate underground networks that would have been impossible in harder, drier soils. The burrows themselves became marvels of prehistoric engineering. Unlike simple animal dens, these underground refuges were designed with multiple purposes in mind. Entry tunnels were typically narrow and inconspicuous, hidden beneath fallen logs or within root systems where they would be difficult for surface predators to detect. These tunnels led to larger chambers that served as living spaces, food storage areas, and emergency shelters. Multiple exit strategies were essential features of every well-designed Carboniferous burrow. Early vertebrates learned to construct tunnel systems with several different escape routes, including underwater exits that connected to nearby streams or ponds. This redundancy meant that even if a giant centipede or other burrowing predator discovered one entrance, the occupants could escape through alternative routes. The excavation process itself required significant evolutionary innovation. Early vertebrates developed stronger, more efficient digging claws and reinforced skull structures that could withstand the stresses of moving large amounts of soil. Their limb muscles became more powerful, and their body proportions shifted to optimize digging efficiency. Some species developed specialized sensory systems that allowed them to navigate underground and detect the approach of burrowing predators through soil vibrations. Underground food storage became a crucial survival strategy during periods when surface foraging was too dangerous. Vertebrates learned to cache food in specially constructed chambers that maintained optimal temperature and humidity conditions. These food stores allowed them to survive extended periods underground, when giant arthropod activity above made surface excursions impossible. The social aspects of burrowing behavior added another layer of complexity to these underground communities. Some species developed communal burrow systems, where multiple individuals or family groups shared interconnected tunnel networks. These underground neighborhoods provided mutual protection through shared sentinel systems and coordinated emergency responses. Seasonal patterns emerged in burrowing behavior, as vertebrates learned to time their major excavation projects around periods of reduced arthropod activity. Many species would expand or renovate their burrow systems during cooler periods, when giant dragonflies were less active and terrestrial arthropods were more sluggish. The psychological impact of spending extended periods underground also shaped vertebrate development. Early amphibians and reptiles that relied heavily on burrowing developed enhanced spatial memory and navigation abilities that allowed them to maintain complex mental maps of their underground territories. They evolved improved tolerance for low-light conditions and refined chemical sensing abilities that helped them navigate by scent markers in dark tunnel systems. Temperature regulation became another crucial advantage of underground living. While surface temperatures in the Carboniferous world could fluctuate dramatically between day and night, underground chambers maintained more stable thermal conditions. This allowed vertebrates to conserve energy that would otherwise be spent on thermoregulation, giving them crucial metabolic advantages during periods of food scarcity. The legacy of Carboniferous burrowing behavior extended far beyond the period itself. The genetic and behavioral foundations laid down during this era of underground living would influence vertebrate evolution for millions of years, creating capabilities that would prove essential during future environmental challenges and contributing to the eventual success of vertebrates as terrestrial animals. The relentless predation pressure from giant arthropods forced early vertebrates to explore every possible avenue of defense, including the development of chemical weapons that would have made even modern poison dart frogs seem modest by comparison. In a world where physical size and speed offered limited protection against creatures with such overwhelming advantages, some vertebrates turned to biochemistry as their primary means of survival. Early amphibians were particularly well positioned to develop sophisticated chemical defenses. Their permeable skin, which had originally evolved for gas exchange in aquatic environments, could be modified to secrete toxic compounds that would make them unpalatable or dangerous to arthropod predators. The development of specialized poison glands in the skin represented one of the most important defensive innovations of the Carboniferous period. These chemical defenses weren't simply borrowed from modern amphibian playbooks. They were entirely new evolutionary experiments designed to deal with predators, unlike anything that exists today. The toxins had to be potent enough to affect arthropods with fundamentally different nervous systems and metabolisms than modern vertebrate predators. They needed to work quickly enough to deter attacks from creatures that could kill with lightning-fast strikes, and they had to be produced in quantities sufficient to protect relatively large vertebrates from massive predators. Warning coloration likely evolved alongside these chemical defenses, creating some of the first examples of aposematic displays in vertebrate evolution. Bright colors, distinctive patterns, and conspicuous markings served to advertise toxicity to potential predators, allowing dangerous prey to avoid potentially fatal encounters. However, this strategy required a delicate balance. The warning displays had to be visible enough to deter arthropod predators, while not making the vertebrates easier targets for aerial hunters like giant dragonflies. The evolutionary arms race that developed between toxic vertebrates and their arthropod predators drove innovations on both sides of the predator-prey equation. Giant scorpions and centipedes began developing more sophisticated venom delivery systems and improved chemical resistance. Some arthropod predators evolved behavioral adaptations that allowed them to handle toxic prey more safely, while others developed enhanced chemical sensing abilities that could detect dangerous prey before making contact. Plant toxins added another layer of complexity to this chemical battlefield. Many carboniferous plants had evolved their own defensive compounds to protect against herbivorous arthropods, creating a three-way chemical arms race between plants, arthropod herbivores, and vertebrate predators. Some clever vertebrates learned to exploit plant toxins for their own defense, either by consuming toxic plants and concentrating their compounds in specialized storage organs, or by using plant chemicals to treat their skin and enhance their own defensive secretions. The development of enhanced chemical sensing abilities became crucial for survival in this toxin-rich environment. Early vertebrates evolved more sophisticated taste and smell receptors that could detect dangerous chemical signatures from considerable distances. These enhanced chemosensory systems allowed them to identify toxic plants that could be useful for defense, detect the presence of chemically armed competitors, and recognize the warning signs of venomous arthropod predators. Detoxification mechanisms also became essential adaptations during this period. Vertebrates that could safely process and eliminate toxic compounds had significant advantages, both in terms of dietary flexibility and defensive capabilities. Enhanced liver function and specialized excretory systems allowed some species to consume toxic prey or plants that would be lethal to competitors. The social implications of chemical warfare created new dynamics in early vertebrate communities. Species with effective chemical defenses could afford to be more conspicuous and active during dangerous periods, while those lacking such protection had to rely more heavily on stealth and concealment. This led to the development of mixed species groups, where chemically defended individuals served as inadvertent bodyguards for more vulnerable community members. The legacy of Carboniferous chemical warfare can still be seen in modern vertebrate biology. Many of the detoxification pathways, chemical sensing mechanisms, and defensive gland structures that evolved during this period became fundamental components of vertebrate physiology. The biochemical innovations driven by the need to survive arthropod predation created capabilities that would prove essential for dealing with toxic environments, venomous predators, and chemical challenges throughout vertebrate evolutionary history. The end of the Carboniferous world came not with sudden catastrophe, but through a gradual transformation that stretched across millions of years, a slow suffocation of the very atmospheric conditions that had made arthropod gigantism possible. The giants that had ruled the land for 60 million years found themselves trapped by the same physics that had once given them dominion over terrestrial ecosystems. The first signs of change appeared in the vast coal swamp forests that had been pumping oxygen into the atmosphere for tens of millions of years. As global climate patterns shifted and sea levels began to drop, these waterlogged forests that had created the oxygen-rich world started to disappear. Drier conditions meant that when the great scale trees and giant ferns died, they decomposed more completely instead of being buried in oxygen-poor swamps. This fundamental change in the carbon cycle began to reverse the atmospheric chemistry that had sustained the age of giants. Temperature fluctuations also began affecting the delicate balance that had maintained the hyperoxic atmosphere. Cooler periods reduced plant productivity and slowed the photosynthetic processes that had been generating excess oxygen for millions of years. The formation of ice sheets at high latitudes locked away water that had previously supported the extensive wetland systems crucial for oxygen production and organic matter burial. For the giant arthropods, these atmospheric changes created insurmountable challenges. As oxygen concentrations began their slow decline from 35% toward more modest levels, the passive respiratory systems that had been their greatest asset became severe limitations. The largest dragonflies were the first to suffer, as their massive flight muscles could no longer extract sufficient oxygen from the thinning air to maintain powered flight. Grounded giants became easy targets for the increasingly sophisticated vertebrate predators that had spent millions of years perfecting their hunting techniques. Giant ground-dwelling arthropods faced their own version of this respiratory crisis. The largest scorpions and centipedes discovered that their simple tracheal systems could no longer deliver adequate oxygen to support their massive bodies and energy-intensive lifestyles. Many species began showing progressive size reduction in the fossil record, a clear sign that only smaller individuals within each species possessed respiratory systems efficient enough to survive in the changing atmosphere. The decline wasn't uniform across all arthropod groups. Some species adapted by becoming more efficient at oxygen extraction, developing enhanced respiratory structures, or shifting to less energy-intensive lifestyles. But the truly giant forms, the creatures that had defined the Carboniferous world, proved too specialized for their hyperoxic environment to survive the atmospheric transition. Meanwhile, vertebrates found themselves benefiting from the very changes that were devastating their former oppressors. As oxygen levels dropped toward more moderate concentrations, the toxic effects of hyperoxic air diminished, allowing vertebrates to become more active during daylight hours and venture into terrestrial habitats that had been off-limits for millions of years. The behavioral restrictions that had kept them small, nocturnal, and aquatic began to lift as their arthropod overlords weakened and disappeared. The psychological liberation was as important as the physical opportunities. For the first time since the Carboniferous began, vertebrates could move through terrestrial environments without the constant threat of encountering predators vastly larger and more powerful than themselves. This freedom from perpetual fear allowed them to invest energy in growth, reproduction, and territorial behavior rather than constant vigilance and concealment. The transition took millions of years to complete, creating a gradual changing of the guard that allowed vertebrates to slowly expand into ecological roles that had been monopolized by giant arthropods. As the last of the mega dragonflies disappeared from ancient skies and the final giant centipedes vanished from forest floors, vertebrates began their own experiments with larger body sizes and more diverse lifestyles. By the end of the Permian period, the world had been fundamentally transformed. The oxygen levels that had sustained arthropod gigantism were gone forever, locked away in coal deposits that preserved the remains of the forests that had created them. The age of giant arthropods had ended, but it had inadvertently prepared vertebrates for their own rise to dominance. As the last giant dragonflies fell silent and the final massive centipedes disappeared into evolutionary memory, vertebrates found themselves inheriting a world transformed. For the first time in 60 million years, the land was no longer ruled by arthropod giants. The creatures that had spent so many generations hiding in water, burrowing underground, and living in constant fear could finally emerge into daylight without terror. The liberation was both physical and psychological. Early amphibians and reptiles began venturing into territories that had been forbidden for millions of years. Open clearings where giant dragonflies had once hunted became safe spaces for basking and feeding. Forest floors where enormous centipedes had stalked became accessible highways for migration and exploration. The three-dimensional prison that had confined vertebrates to aquatic margins was finally unlocked. Size restrictions that had kept vertebrates small for evolutionary ages began to lift. Without the threat of predators vastly larger than themselves, early reptiles could afford to invest energy in growth rather than concealment. Some lineages began experimenting with larger body forms, developing the foundation for the giant reptiles that would eventually dominate the Permian period and beyond. Behavioral changes were equally dramatic. The hypervigilant, constantly fearful demeanor that had characterized Carboniferous vertebrates gave way to more confident exploration of terrestrial environments. Diurnal activity became possible for the first time as the skies cleared of aerial predators with wingspans larger than a person's reach. The obsessive attachment to water sources relaxed as vertebrates discovered they could venture further from aquatic refuges without encountering insurmountable terrestrial threats. Territorial behavior, virtually impossible when survival required constant hiding, began to emerge among vertebrate populations. Males could afford to compete openly for mates and resources without attracting the attention of predators that would have made such displays suicidal. Complex social structures started developing as groups no longer needed to maintain absolute silence and minimal visibility to survive. The vacant ecological niches left by extinct arthropod giants created unprecedented opportunities for evolutionary experimentation. Vertebrates began exploring predatory roles that had been monopolized by arthropods for tens of millions of years. Some lineages developed enhanced hunting capabilities. Others specialized in processing the abundant plant resources that were no longer being consumed by giant millipedes and other herbivorous arthropods. Reproductive strategies also transformed as parental care became less risky. Vertebrates could invest more energy in protecting and nurturing their young without the constant threat that extended exposure would attract deadly predators. This allowed for the development of more sophisticated developmental patterns and enhanced learning behaviors that would prove crucial for future evolutionary success. The colonization of fully terrestrial habitats accelerated rapidly once the arthropod barriers were removed. Desert regions, highland areas, and other environments that had been completely inaccessible to vertebrates during the Carboniferous became new frontiers for evolutionary exploration. This geographic expansion led to adaptive radiations that filled the planet with vertebrate diversity. Perhaps most importantly, the psychological scars left by millions of years of arthropod predation began to heal. While some behavioral patterns persisted, the instinctive wariness of confined spaces, enhanced predator detection systems, and rapid escape responses, vertebrates gradually developed the confidence that would allow them to become the dominant large animals on land. The transition wasn't immediate. Generations of vertebrates carried genetic and behavioral memories of the terror that had defined their ancestors' lives. But gradually, inevitably, these creatures that had survived the ultimate test of predation pressure began to explore the full potential of vertebrate biology. The foundation was laid for the age of reptiles, the eventual rise of dinosaurs, and ultimately the emergence of mammals and birds that would inherit the modern world. The Carboniferous world is gone, but its influence echoes through every aspect of modern life, in ways both obvious and hidden. The coal deposits that power much of our industrial civilization are the compressed remains of those oxygen-producing forests that created the atmospheric conditions for arthropod gigantism. Every time we burn coal for energy, we're releasing carbon that was locked away during the age when dragonflies ruled the skies and centipedes stalked the forest floors. Modern arthropods still carry the genetic blueprints for gigantism, but they're constrained by atmospheric conditions that will never again support creatures of carboniferous proportions. Today's largest terrestrial arthropods, coconut crabs, giant centipedes, and Goliath beetles, represent the absolute maximum size possible under current oxygen concentrations. They exist at the very limits of what their respiratory systems can support, living demonstrations of the physical laws that once allowed their ancestors to grow so much larger. Interestingly, some modern arthropods have found ways around these size limitations by returning to aquatic environments. The Japanese spider crab, with its enormous leg span, and giant isopods dwelling in deep ocean trenches, have discovered that water's ability to support body weight and deliver dissolved oxygen allows them to achieve sizes that would be impossible on land. They're following the same strategy that kept marine arthropods relatively modest during the Carboniferous, using water's properties to overcome the limitations of their respiratory systems. The behavioral legacies of the Carboniferous period run even deeper in modern vertebrates. The instinctive fear of spiders and many-legged creatures that persists across human cultures may be an evolutionary memory of a time when such fears were essential for survival. Our tendency to seek high ground when threatened, our discomfort in enclosed spaces, and our heightened alertness in dense vegetation all echo survival strategies that our ancestors developed during their millions of years, hiding from arthropod giants. Scientific research continues to reveal new details about this extraordinary period. Advances in atmospheric chemistry modeling help us understand how oxygen levels rose to such extreme heights and why they eventually declined. Improved fossil analysis techniques are uncovering evidence of arthropod behaviors and interactions that were previously invisible in the geological record. Computer simulations of carboniferous ecosystems are revealing the complex relationships between atmospheric composition, plant communities, and animal gigantism. The Carboniferous also provides crucial insights for understanding how life might evolve on other worlds. Astronomers searching for habitable planets now consider atmospheric composition as carefully as temperature and water availability. The lesson of the Carboniferous, that small changes in atmospheric chemistry can completely restructure planetary ecosystems, has profound implications for how we think about life beyond Earth. Perhaps most importantly, this ancient period reminds us of the contingent nature of evolutionary dominance. For 60 million years, arthropods ruled terrestrial ecosystems with such complete authority that vertebrates seemed destined to remain small, aquatic creatures forever. The eventual reversal of this dominance shows us that even the most established patterns of life can be transformed by changing environmental conditions. The coal beneath our feet, the behaviors embedded in our genes, and the size limits that constrain modern arthropods all serve as monuments to a time when our world operated according to entirely different rules, a time when water was safer than land, and giants walked the earth on hundreds of legs. The study of the Carboniferous period has fundamentally altered our understanding of how atmospheric composition shapes the evolution of life on Earth. Before researchers recognized the connection between oxygen levels and arthropod gigantism, the existence of dragonflies with wingspans approaching 3 feet seemed almost impossible. Now we understand that these creatures weren't evolutionary accidents, but inevitable consequences of specific atmospheric conditions that created unique opportunities for biological innovation. This research has revealed the delicate balance that governs which types of organisms can dominate planetary ecosystems. The Carboniferous demonstrates that evolutionary success isn't solely determined by superior design or competitive advantages, but can be dramatically influenced by environmental factors that favor certain physiological approaches over others. The respiratory systems that made arthropods so successful during high oxygen periods became severe limitations when atmospheric composition shifted. Modern climate science has gained crucial insights from studying how Carboniferous carbon cycles created and eventually destroyed the conditions for arthropod gigantism. The formation of coal deposits during this period removed vast amounts of carbon from the atmosphere while simultaneously increasing oxygen levels, a process that operated on timescales of millions of years but created effects so dramatic they reshaped entire ecosystems. The Carboniferous also provides sobering lessons about the speed at which environmental changes can restructure life on Earth. While the atmospheric shifts that ended arthropod dominance occurred gradually by human standards, they were rapid enough to prevent adaptation by creatures that had ruled terrestrial ecosystems for tens of millions of years. This has implications for understanding how modern species might respond to current atmospheric changes. Perhaps most importantly, the Carboniferous period challenges our assumptions about the inevitability of vertebrate dominance on land. For 60 million years, the most sophisticated vertebrates were small, aquatic creatures living in the shadows of arthropod giants. The eventual reversal of this relationship shows us that even the most established patterns in evolution can be transformed by changing environmental conditions. These discoveries continue to influence fields ranging from astrobiology to conservation biology. When scientists search for signs of life on other planets, they now consider atmospheric composition as carefully as temperature and water availability. The lesson that small changes in air chemistry can completely reorganize planetary ecosystems has profound implications for understanding life's possibilities throughout the universe. The Carboniferous reminds us that our current world, where vertebrates dominate the land and arthropods remain mostly small, is not an inevitable outcome of evolution, but rather the result of specific atmospheric conditions that have persisted since the end of the Paleozoic era. Understanding this contingency helps us appreciate both the remarkable journey that brought vertebrates to dominance and the environmental stability that maintains the world we know today. As you rest tonight, remember that you are the descendant of survivors who endured the ultimate test of evolutionary resilience. Your ancestors lived through 60 million years when simply stepping onto dry land meant facing creatures of impossible size and terrifying capability. They survived by developing ingenuity, cooperation, and an unshakable determination to persist, despite overwhelming odds. The air you breathe carries just enough oxygen to sustain complex life, without creating the monsters that once made land uninhabitable. The forests around you rustle with creatures that follow familiar patterns of predator and prey, where size and danger exist in proportions that make sense to vertebrate minds. The water that once served as humanity's only refuge from arthropod giants now provides gentle recreation rather than desperate sanctuary. This extraordinary chapter in Earth's history reminds us how remarkable our current world truly is. The balance of atmospheric gases, the modest size of terrestrial arthropods, and the dominance of vertebrates on land all represent a delicate equilibrium that has persisted for hundreds of millions of years. We live in the gentle aftermath of that ancient terror, inheritors of a planet where vertebrates finally claimed their place as masters of terrestrial ecosystems. Rest peacefully, knowing that the nightmares of the Carboniferous world are buried deep in geological time, preserved only in coal deposits and fossil traces of a period when water was safer than land, and giants walked the earth on countless legs. If you've enjoyed this video, then like it and subscribe to our channel to stay updated on new uploads. Sweet dreams, my friends.